At first glance, the Ten Commandments seem to deal with only a handful of fairly obvious scenarios. Don't create any idols. Don't murder anyone. Don't steal or commit adultery. Pretty easy, right?
Well, not so fast. Jesus shows us in the Sermon on the Mount that the commandments are deeper and it's a lot wider than we first realized.
First of all, the commandments are deep. They're deep because they apply not only to our outward actions, but to the inward dispositions of our heart.
In his take on the sixth commandment against murder, Jesus says these words, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you, anyone who is angry with the brother or sister will be subject to judgment."
And with respect to the commandment against adultery, he claims this: "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Do you see what Jesus is saying? It's not enough to clean up your act.
Yeah.
God cares about your heart as well. It's not that God doesn't care about your behavior or the real consequences of our actions for other people, so long as our intentions are pure. That's not what we're saying. But with respect to our formation, God's law isn't aiming at regulating our behavior. It's aiming at the total transformation of our being. He doesn't want people who just don't murder. He wants people who love instead of hate. He doesn't want just people who don't cheat on their partners. He wants people who are faithful to their core.
In fact, when Jesus is asked to summarize the greatest commandment in the entire Bible, he says this: "Love the Lord God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." The first is the greatest commandment, and the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. That's in Matthew, the 22nd chapter.
Jesus says that the whole law and everything the prophets said to God's people can be summed up in love God with everything you got and love your neighbor as yourself.
And in fact, the 10 commandments are actually organized in this way. The first 4 commandments are about loving God, and the next 6 are about loving your neighbor. Jesus wasn't making up some new and easier law. He was digging out the inner core of God's law that God already gave his people. That inner core, the deepest part of the law, Jesus says, is love.
Yeah, so the commands are deep, but they're also wide. They're wide because they apply to a huge range of situations that, at first glance, we might think they leave out. For example, when Jesus goes on about the commandment against murder, he says this: "Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, 'Raka,' is answerable to the court, and anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell." Do you see what Jesus is saying? He is including name calling in the law against murder. How can he do that? Well, he can do that because he sees the broader principle underneath the commandment against murder. He sees that God is calling us not just to not kill our neighbor, but to refrain from harming them in any way. Bullying someone, according to Jesus, is a violation of the 6th commandment. Let that sink in the next time you're on Twitter.
And not only that, but we can go further and say that the 6th commandment requires us not just to refrain from harming our neighbor, but to do all we can to promote and protect the life of our neighbor.
Yeah.
In fact, the flip side of every prohibition in the 10 commandments is a positive requirement. Don't steal? Yeah. Also, provide what your neighbor needs. Don't commit adultery. True. And do everything you can to love your spouse well and please them. Don't lie? Right. But also be such a person of integrity that people don't even need you to make promises because they know your yes is yes and your no is no.
This is huge for the types of moral questions we face in our everyday lives, isn't it? It's not every day that we face the real choice to murder someone or not. But if the scope of the commandment is not just murder, but the protection and promotion of another's life,
Yes.
then it applies to countless situations we face daily. Do I keep walking, or do I lend this person a helping hand? Do I cut down my partner with my words, or do I forgive them and ask how they need me to show up for them right now?
Wow.
Do I support policies or politicians that treat some people's lives as important and others as disposable? All of a sudden, the commandment against murder gives us insight into much, much more of our life.
Jesus shows us that the law of God goes deeper into our souls than we might ever expect, and is wider in its application than we might often think possible.
But remember, as we seek out to live our faith according to the deep principles of the commandments, as we pursue a life of love for God and the people around us, we're never doing this out of a need to perform for God's love of us. He already loves you. Jesus already died to save you. The commandments offer us a guide to how we show our love and gratitude to a God whose love for us is so deep and so wide.
Our prayer for you is the same as the Apostle Paul's when he says, I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and how long and how high and how deep is the love of Christ. And to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God.